Michael Anthony was never the loudest voice in Van Halen. He was not the one leaping off drum risers, not the one shattering expectations with blistering solos, not the one commanding interviews with sharp edges and myth-making quotes. He was the constant, the anchor, the man who showed up, locked in, and held the chaos together while the world watched the spectacle unfold above him. And for decades, that role defined both his strength and his vulnerability. Because in a band built on ego, brilliance, and control, being dependable can slowly turn into being taken for granted. Behind Van Halen's explosive riffs, wild stage energy, and headline-grabbing feuds, Michael Anthony carried a quieter burden. His bass lines were never meant to dominate the mix, yet without them the sound would have collapsed. His high backing vocals became one of the band's most recognizable signatures, lifting choruses into anthems that filled arenas. Fans sang along without ever asking whose voice they were really hearing. That invisibility, at first, seemed like the price of harmony. Later, it would become the justification for erasure. What makes Michael Anthony's story so unsettling is that it does not begin with conflict. It begins with loyalty. He joined the band not as a hired gun, but as a full partner, at a time when Van Halen was still fighting for credibility in clubs and school gyms. He shared the grind, the debts, the long nights, and the early uncertainty. When success came, he stayed the same. While tensions flared between other members, Anthony became known as the stable one, the mediator, the person who kept his head down and the music moving forward. That reputation followed him everywhere. Dependable, low maintenance, easy to work with. In most industries, those are virtues. In a power struggle, they can become liabilities. The breaking point in this story does not arrive with screaming arguments or public implosions. It arrives quietly, through paperwork, timing, and silence. Anthony would later describe moments where decisions affecting his future were made around him rather than with him. Credits disappeared. Ownership shifted. His status subtly changed from equal member to something closer to an employee, even while his face remained part of the band's image. He stayed, partly out of love for the music, partly out of hope that loyalty would eventually be recognized, and partly because walking away from something you helped build feels like cutting off a part of yourself. The most painful chapter, according to Anthony, was not losing money or status. It was losing respect. Years later, when public comments emerged that questioned his musicianship and minimized his contributions, the narrative hardened. The man who had helped define the band's sound was suddenly portrayed as replaceable, even expendable. For fans, this rewrote history. For Anthony, it rewrote his own past in real time. This is not a story about villains and heroes in simple terms. It is a story about how power shifts inside legendary bands, how loyalty can be exploited, and how silence can be mistaken for weakness. When Michael Anthony finally speaks, he does not sound bitter. He sounds reflective. And that may be the most uncomfortable part of all. Long before stadium lights, platinum records, and internal power struggles, Michael Anthony's relationship with music was shaped by discipline rather than ambition. His childhood was not driven by dreams of fame, but by exposure. Music was present in his home in a practical, almost workmanlike way, largely through his father, who played the trumpet. That presence mattered. It meant that music was something you practiced, not something you posed for. You learned it slowly, you respected it, and you earned your place inside it. That mindset would later define Michael's role inside Van Halen, for better and for worse. As a young student, Anthony followed a traditional musical path. He learned trumpet, participated in school bands, and became familiar with structured rehearsal and ensemble responsibility. When his family relocated to Southern California in the mid-1960s, he entered an environment where rock music was rapidly becoming a cultural force rather than a rebellious novelty. Yet even then, his instinct was not to chase the spotlight. At around 13, he gravitated toward the bass guitar, an instrument most teenagers ignored in favor of flashier options. He wanted to be different, but more importantly, he wanted to be useful. Bass was the instrument that held everything together, the one that demanded restraint, timing, and awareness of others. There's a widely told story about Anthony modifying a borrowed Fender Mustang guitar into a bass by removing strings. Whether taken literally or symbolically, it captures something essential about his development. He did not wait for perfect circumstances or ideal tools. He adapted. His father eventually supported this commitment by purchasing a proper Fender Precision bass and amplifier, a moment that marked the transition from curiosity to dedication. From there, Anthony immersed himself in the work. He studied players known not for theatrics, but for musical intelligence and solidity. Musicians like Jack Bruce and John Paul Jones, bassists who understood that power came from control. Another detail often overlooked is that Anthony was naturally left-handed but learned to play right-handed. This required retraining instinct, patience, and humility. It also foreshadowed a pattern that would repeat throughout his career, adjusting himself to fit the needs of a larger structure. In his early bands, particularly the group later known as Snake, Anthony was not just a bassist. He sang lead and backing vocals, developing a vocal range that would later become a defining but undercredited part of Van Halen's sound. Those years in local clubs, school dances, and community events hardened his professionalism. He learned how to perform consistently, how to support a song rather than dominate it, and how to keep an audience engaged without theatrics. The Southern California music scene of the early 1970s was competitive but interconnected. Bands crossed paths constantly, shared equipment, and built reputations as much through behavior as talent. It was during this period that Anthony's path intersected with a young band called Mammoth, fronted by brothers Eddie and Alex Van Halen. One night, when Mammoth's sound system failed before a show, Anthony offered Snake's equipment so the performance could continue. It was a small gesture, but in a scene fueled by ego, it stood out. Reliability was remembered. Shortly after, Mammoth found itself without a bassist. The Van Halen brothers recalled Anthony's professionalism and invited him to jam. The chemistry was immediate. His bass playing locked effortlessly with Alex's drumming, and his backing vocals added a new dimension to the band's sound. It was not just that he could play, it was that he understood space. He knew when to step forward and when to disappear into the structure. That quality allowed Eddie's guitar to sound even more explosive by contrast. When Mammoth changed its name to Van Halen, solidifying the band's identity around the brothers, Michael Anthony became part of what fans would later call the classic lineup. At the time, it felt like a shared ascent. Everyone worked, everyone toured, everyone struggled. Anthony was treated as a full partner, sharing debts, decisions, and early revenues. The debut album's success in 1978 did not erase that sense of unity. His bass lines anchored the songs, and his high harmonies lifted them into something unmistakable. Yet embedded in that early structure was a quiet imbalance. The band name, the mythology, and the public narrative centered on others. Anthony's role was essential but understated. He was building a foundation so solid that no one thought to question who owned it. And that, slowly, set the stage for everything that would come later. As Van Halen's success accelerated, the band entered a phase where fame no longer felt like momentum, but like pressure. Tours grew larger, expectations intensified, and the internal balance that had once felt organic began to harden in a hierarchy. From the outside, this era looked like triumph stacked on triumph. Inside, it became a negotiation over power, ownership, and whose voice truly mattered when decisions were made. For Michael Anthony, this was the moment when being easygoing and loyal quietly turned into a disadvantage. In the band's early years, Anthony was treated as an equal not just musically, but financially. According to former manager Noel Monk, all four members shared responsibility for debts and profits alike. That arrangement reflected reality. Anthony was not a session player. His bass anchored the songs, his backing vocals defined the choruses, and his onstage presence completed the chemistry audiences paid to see. But as record sales climbed into the millions and Van Halen became a global brand, the question of control moved from the background to the center. Success magnifies everything, including insecurity. And in a band driven by extraordinary talent, it also magnified ego. The album 1984 marked both a creative peak and a turning point. Publicly, it was the sound of a band at full power, producing hits that would dominate radio and define an era. Privately, it was the moment when lines were redrawn. According to Monk's account, Michael Anthony was presented with a contract during the tour that fundamentally altered his relationship to the band. He was pressured to sign away future songwriting credits and royalties, a move that would strip him of ownership over music he helped create. The timing and setting were crucial. The document was introduced backstage, just hours before a performance, with the other members present. Whether or not one chooses to interpret that as intimidation, the imbalance was undeniable. Saying no would have meant confrontation, potential chaos, and possibly derailing the tour. Anthony signed. That decision has echoed through the rest of his career. By relinquishing songwriting credits, he also relinquished a claim to the band's long-term financial legacy. Royalties from reissues, greatest hits albums, licensing deals, and continued airplay flow through ownership, not memory. 1984 alone went on to sell over 10 million copies in the United States. For Anthony, that meant watching a body of work he helped shape continue to generate wealth and cultural relevance, while his own stakes steadily diminished. More damaging than the financial loss was what the contract symbolized. He was no longer an equal partner. He had become, in effect, a hired performer inside a band he had helped build from the ground up. What followed was not an immediate dismissal, but a gradual narrowing of space. Anthony remained on tour and in the studio, maintaining the same level of professionalism he always had. He did not speak publicly about the contract at the time. He did not threaten to leave. He did not air grievances. His stated motivation was simple. He wanted to keep playing music and keep the band together. That silence, however, had consequences. Without public resistance, the new arrangement became normalized. His reduced status quietly set a precedent that made future exclusions easier to justify. As the years passed, Anthony's role began to shrink in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. During later recording sessions, his contributions were limited. On the album Van Halen 3, he played bass on only a fraction of the tracks, with Eddie Van Halen handling bass duties on the rest. Publicly, Anthony was still presented as a member. Behind the scenes, his creative input was being sidelined. Compilation albums followed a similar pattern. New tracks were recorded without him playing bass, leaving him confined to backing vocals, the very element of his work that was most easily dismissed as secondary. The emotional toll of this marginalization became more visible when Eddie Van Halen began publicly questioning Anthony's musicianship. In interviews, Eddie suggested that he had to show Anthony how to play his parts, implying that the bassist lacked initiative or skill. These comments shocked many fans and fellow musicians who had watched Anthony perform consistently at a high level for decades. For Anthony, the criticism cut deeper because it came not from an outsider, but from a longtime collaborator. He later denied the claims outright, stating that he had always learned his parts independently and that there was no evidence to support Eddie's narrative. The damage, however, was already done. Public perception is fragile. When a figure is revered as Eddie Van Halen speaks, his words reshape history. Suddenly, the quiet foundation player was being reframed as expendable. Anthony described those moments as emotionally draining, not because of pride, but because they rewrote his contribution in front of a new generation of fans. Silence, once his shield, now worked against him. The absence of loud self-defense made it easier for others to define him. By the mid-2000s, communication between Anthony and the Van Halen brothers had largely ceased. When the band reunited with Sammy Hagar for a tour in 2004, Anthony was allowed to participate only under reduced financial terms, effectively treated as a contracted employee rather than a core member. The tour was commercially successful, but it offered no emotional resolution. Behind the scenes, decisions were already being made about his replacement. The final blow came not through conversation, but through discovery. In 2006, Eddie Van Halen appointed his teenage son, Wolfgang Van Halen, as the band's new bassist. Anthony was not formally informed. He learned of the change through online reports and fan speculation. After decades of loyalty, there was no phone call, no private explanation, no acknowledgement of the transition. For Anthony, this was not just replacement. It was erasure. He has since described that moment as the true end of his time with Van Halen. Not because he lost a job, but because he lost the dignity of closure. The band moved forward without him, and the story of Van Halen continued to be told with his presence minimized. What remained was a question that still unsettles fans. How does someone so essential become so easily written out? Michael Anthony did not respond with bitterness. Instead, he moved on, collaborating with Sammy Hagar in projects that reaffirmed his value as both a musician and a partner. Those later successes stand as quiet rebuttals to the narrative that diminished him. Yet the Van Halen chapter remains unresolved. It is a story of how loyalty can be exploited, how silence can be mistaken for weakness, and how even the most legendary bands can fracture under the weight of control. After Michael Anthony's removal from Van Halen became irreversible, the public narrative shifted quickly, almost too quickly. History has a way of reorganizing itself around whoever still controls the microphone, the brand, and the archives. For Anthony, the aftermath was not defined by explosive retaliation or dramatic interviews. It was defined by something far more difficult to endure, watching the story of his own life be retold without him at the center of it. When a band as large as Van Halen rewrites its internal history, the revision does not feel like a correction. It feels like erasure. What made this period particularly painful was not simply the loss of a role, but the loss of context. Fans who discovered Van Halen later were often exposed to a version of events that framed Anthony as a peripheral figure, someone who had been present but not essential. The public comments questioning his musicianship lingered in interviews, headlines, and online discussions, slowly hardening into assumption. Anthony found himself in the strange position of having to defend a legacy he had never previously needed to explain. For decades, his work had spoken for itself. Now it was being spoken over. Anthony eventually addressed the situation in interviews and fan question sessions, and when he did, his tone surprised many people. There was no bitterness, no attempt to dismantle Eddie Van Halen's genius or diminish the band's achievements. Instead, he focused on clarity. He confirmed that he had signed away rights under pressure, that he had remained silent to keep the band together, and that the public criticisms of his abilities were untrue. He emphasized that if he had truly been incapable, there would be recordings, rehearsal tapes, or witnesses to support that claim. None exist. His defense was factual, not emotional, and that restraint gave his words credibility. Still, restraint has limits. The longer Anthony stayed quiet, the easier it became for others to define him. In rock culture, silence is often interpreted as agreement. That dynamic worked against him. Fans who had watched him perform flawlessly night after night struggled to reconcile the dissonance between what they had seen and what they were now being told. Musicians from outside the Van Halen camp were often more vocal in his defense than the band itself. Many pointed out that Anthony's bass playing was never about flash, but about precision, and that his vocal harmonies were a defining feature of the band's sound, not an accessory. As Van Halen moved further into the 2000s, Anthony's absence became normalized. New generations accepted the lineup changes as evolution rather than rupture. Meanwhile, Anthony rebuilt his career in a way that quietly contradicted the narrative of decline. Reuniting with Sammy Hagar, he found himself in an environment that valued collaboration over control. Projects like Chickenfoot were not nostalgia acts. They were proof of continued relevance. The band's success, including strong album sales and critical praise, demonstrated that Anthony's skills had not diminished. If anything, Freed from internal politics, his playing and presence felt reinvigorated. What stands out in this phase is the contrast. While Van Halen's legacy became increasingly guarded, fractured, and emotionally unresolved, Anthony's post-Van Halen work was marked by openness and mutual respect. He did not try to recreate the past. He built something new with people who wanted him there. That distinction matters. It suggests that the problem was never talent or commitment. It was environment. The possibility of closure briefly reemerged after Eddie Van Halen's death in 2020. Fans hoped that time and loss might soften old divisions. Reports surfaced of discussions around a tribute or reunion project that would honor Eddie's legacy. According to multiple sources, Michael Anthony was contacted and expressed willingness to participate. For the first time in years, it seemed possible that the story might circle back to dignity rather than silence. Yet even in grief, old fractures remained. Disagreements over format, purpose, and emotional boundaries stalled the project. David Lee Roth reportedly resisted aspects of the tribute, and Alex Van Halen's declining health further complicated matters. When the idea collapsed, it did so quietly, without ceremony. There was no final statement, no definitive explanation, only the slow realization that the reunion many fans had hoped for would never happen. For Anthony, this meant losing the last realistic chance for closure with the band as a whole. He has since spoken about that disappointment with measured honesty. He acknowledged the outreach. He acknowledged his interest. And he acknowledged that some wounds were simply too deep, too layered, and too late to heal. Perhaps the most striking aspect of this chapter is Anthony's refusal to weaponize the story. He has never positioned himself as a martyr or framed the Van Halen brothers as villains. Instead, he speaks of complex people, damaged communication, and decisions driven by fear as much as ambition. That nuance is uncomfortable for audiences conditioned to pick sides. It forces listeners to accept that multiple truths can coexist. Eddie Van Halen can be a once-in-a-generation genius. Van Halen can be one of the greatest rock bands of all time. And Michael Anthony can still have been treated unfairly. In the end, part 4 of this story is about legacy management. Not the official kind, but the personal kind. Anthony's legacy does not rely on rewriting Van Halen's history. It relies on continuity, on the fact that when he steps on stage today, audiences still recognize the sound, still respond to the voice, still feel the groove that once held together some of the loudest, most chaotic rock shows of an era. His story challenges a comforting myth that talent alone guarantees respect. In reality, power decides who is remembered loudly and who is remembered quietly. Michael Anthony remains the man who did not fight for the spotlight, even when the spotlight was taken from him. That choice cost him status, money, and visibility, but it preserved something else: integrity. And in a story defined by control and conflict, that may be the most enduring legacy of all. As time passed, Michael Anthony's story began to separate itself from Van Halen's shadow in a way that felt almost ironic. The further he moved from the band that defined his early fame, the clearer his individual identity became. This phase was not about revenge or reclaiming a throne. It was about survival, self-respect, and the quiet rebuilding of a life that had been narrowed by years of compromise. If the earlier chapters were about loyalty tested and dignity strained, this one is about endurance without bitterness. Anthony's reunion with Sammy Hagar marked a turning point. Their connection had always been rooted in mutual respect rather than hierarchy, and when they joined forces again, it felt less like a comeback and more like a release. Projects such as The Other Half and later Chickenfoot allowed Anthony to step into a space where his contributions were not questioned or minimized. He was not there to fill a slot. He was there because the music required him. That distinction mattered deeply. In these collaborations, Anthony's bass playing was not buried or replaced. His vocals were not treated as optional texture. They were integral, acknowledged, and celebrated. Chickenfoot, in particular, became a quiet rebuttal to years of doubt cast on Anthony's abilities. With musicians of undeniable stature around him, His role was once again foundational. Critics noted the chemistry, the groove, and the balance of the band's sound. Fans responded not out of nostalgia, but out of recognition. They heard the same qualities that had once powered Van Halen's biggest moments. The difference was that now, those qualities were openly credited. Anthony was no longer invisible. He was present in interviews, present in songwriting conversations, and present in the narrative of the band's success. Yet even as his post-Van Halen career flourished, the emotional residue of his earlier experiences did not disappear. In interviews, Anthony often reflected on his time in Van Halen with a tone that mixed gratitude and regret. He acknowledged the opportunities the band gave him, the music they created, and the fans they reached. At the same time, he did not hide the pain of how it ended. What stands out is his refusal to dramatize that pain. He did not frame himself as a victim of a single moment or person. Instead, he described a gradual breakdown of communication, trust, and mutual respect. That framing suggests a man who has spent years processing rather than reacting. One of the most telling aspects of Anthony's later reflections is how he speaks about silence. For a long time, he believed staying quiet was the right thing to do. He believed that loyalty meant not speaking publicly, not contradicting bandmates, and not challenging narratives that diminished him. With hindsight, he has admitted that this silence came at a cost. It allowed others to define the story in ways that were incomplete or misleading. It also taught him a difficult lesson. Silence does not always protect unity. Sometimes it only protects power. This realization did not turn Anthony into a confrontational figure. Instead, it reshaped how he valued himself. In later collaborations, he made it clear that mutual respect was non-negotiable. He chose environments where conversation replaced control and where disagreements did not automatically become power plays. That choice, more than any public statement, marked his growth. He was no longer willing to trade dignity for proximity to fame. The canceled tribute and reunion discussions after Eddie Van Halen's death further clarified this shift. Anthony's willingness to participate showed that he was not clinging to resentment. He was open to honoring the past. But when the project collapsed under unresolved tensions and conflicting visions, he accepted the outcome without public accusation. For him, closure did not require a stage or a final bow. It required honesty. He had already made peace with the fact that some chapters do not end cleanly. This acceptance also reframed how fans began to see him. Over time, a growing segment of the audience revisited Van Halen's catalog with fresh ears. They noticed the consistency of the bass lines, the clarity of the harmonies, and the way Anthony's presence anchored the band's most chaotic moments. Online discussions shifted from dismissal to reassessment. Younger musicians cited him as an example of restraint and musical intelligence rather than flash. In an era increasingly saturated with technical spectacle, Anthony's approach began to feel quietly modern. What makes this phase of the story resonate is its universality. Michael Anthony's experience mirrors that of many people who contribute deeply to successful systems without controlling them. He built, supported, and sustained something extraordinary, only to be told later that his role was secondary. His response was not to burn the structure down, but to step away and build again on healthier terms. That choice requires a kind of strength rarely celebrated in rock mythology. By the time Anthony reached his 70s, the idea of exposure took on a different meaning. It was no longer about revealing secrets or assigning blame. It was about reclaiming authorship over his own narrative. When he spoke publicly, he did so with clarity rather than anger. He acknowledged mistakes, including his own. He admitted that he might have spoken sooner, that he might have pushed back harder. But he also recognized that the person he was then made the choices that felt right at the time. In the end, Part 5 is not about redemption in the dramatic sense. It is about balance. Michael Anthony's legacy does not depend on winning an argument with the past. It depends on the fact that his music continues to work. It depends on the respect of peers who choose him, not out of obligation, but out of trust. And it depends on the quiet understanding that sometimes the most revealing stories are not the loudest ones, but the ones told after the noise fades. His journey challenges a familiar myth, that history belongs to those who speak the loudest. Sometimes, history belongs to those who endure long enough to speak clearly. In the later years of Michael Anthony's life, reflection replaced urgency. The battles were no longer about contracts, credits, or positions within a band. They were about meaning. After decades in an industry that often rewards volume over substance, Anthony reached a stage where perspective mattered more than recognition. This phase of his story is quieter, but it carries weight because it reveals how a man comes to terms with a legacy that was both extraordinary and incomplete. One of the most significant shifts in Anthony's outlook was how he began to talk about the past without trying to correct it. He did not seek to rewrite Van Halen's history in his favor, nor did he attempt to dismantle the mythology surrounding Eddie Van Halen. Instead, he accepted that public memory is selective and often unfair. That acceptance was not resignation. It was clarity. He understood that fighting for validation from a system that had already moved on would only prolong the pain. The music, not the arguments, would be his final statement. Anthony has often emphasized that his greatest satisfaction comes not from accolades, but from a knowledge that he contributed something lasting. When fans approach him at shows or conventions, they rarely talk about contracts or lawsuits. They talk about songs. They talk about moments in their lives that were soundtracked by Van Halen records. Anthony listens, signs autographs, and thanks them. In those interactions, the hierarchy that once diminished him disappears. There is no lead or supporting role. There is only shared experience. For him, that has become the truest measure of success. His relationship with the Van Halen legacy remains complicated. He has expressed regret that certain relationships were never repaired, particularly with Eddie before his death. That regret is not framed as guilt, but as loss. The absence of a final conversation, a final understanding, lingers. Anthony has acknowledged that he hoped time would soften tensions, that distance might allow for reconciliation. When that opportunity vanished, it forced him to confront a painful truth. Not all stories resolve themselves, and not all apologies are spoken aloud. Despite this, Anthony has never used Eddie's passing as a platform for grievance. He has consistently spoken with respect about Eddie's talent and impact, even when addressing the conflicts between them. That restraint has shaped how many fans now view him. In an era where public figures often monetize conflict, Anthony's refusal to exploit tragedy stands out. It reinforces the sense that his values were always at odds with the more aggressive dynamics of fame and control. As the possibility of a final Van Halen reunion faded, Anthony redirected his energy toward the present. He continued touring with Sammy Hagar and The Circle, playing to audiences that valued musicianship and camaraderie over nostalgia alone. These performances were not about reclaiming a past role, but about celebrating the act of making music itself. On stage, Anthony appeared relaxed, confident, and fully engaged. The joy was visible, and for many fans, it was a reminder that fulfillment does not always come from resolution, but from continuity. Another important aspect of this period is how Anthony began to speak more openly about boundaries. He has acknowledged that in his younger years, he equated loyalty with self-sacrifice. Over time, he learned that loyalty without mutual respect becomes exploitation. This realization did not harden him. It clarified him. He became more selective about projects, more deliberate about partnerships, and more protective of his time and energy. In doing so, he modeled a version of success rarely discussed in rock culture: the ability to step back without bitterness. Anthony's story also resonates beyond music. It mirrors the experiences of countless individuals who contribute deeply to organizations or families only to find themselves marginalized when power consolidates elsewhere. His journey offers a counter-narrative to the idea that recognition naturally follows contribution. It suggests that recognition must often be asserted, or it risks being rewritten. Anthony did not assert himself loudly, but he asserted himself through endurance, professionalism, and eventual honesty. In interviews, when asked if he would change anything, Anthony's answers are measured. He does not claim he would have fought harder or walked away sooner. He acknowledges that every decision was shaped by who he was at the time. That humility adds depth to his reflections. It avoids the trap of hindsight's certainty. Instead, it honors the complexity of living through events without knowing how they will be remembered. As Part 6 closes, Michael Anthony stands not as a symbol of betrayal or vindication, but as a study in quiet resilience. His legacy is not confined to a single band or era. It lives in the grooves of records that still resonate, in the voices of fans who recognize his contribution, and in the example he sets for those navigating similar struggles. He may never receive the dramatic closure that rock mythology promises, but he has achieved something arguably more rare. He has made peace with his story without surrendering its truth. In a world that often confuses noise with importance, Michael Anthony's journey reminds us that impact does not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply endures. In the end, Michael Anthony's story does not conclude with a reunion, a final apology, or a dramatic reclaiming of what was lost. It ends with something quieter and perhaps more honest. It ends with acceptance, not of injustice, but of reality. After decades inside one of the most volatile and celebrated bands in rock history, Anthony emerged without the bitterness that so often follows exclusion. That absence of bitterness is not weakness. It is resolution. When people look back at Van Halen, the spotlight will always fall first on virtuosity, excess, and innovation. Eddie Van Halen's genius is unquestionable. The band's influence on rock music is permanent. None of that changes when Michael Anthony speaks his truth. What changes is the depth of the story. Suddenly, the music sounds fuller. The harmonies feel intentional rather than incidental. The bass lines feel like choices, not defaults. Anthony's presence, once overlooked, becomes impossible to unhear. His journey forces a difficult question onto the mythology of greatness. How many essential contributors remain invisible because they're not the loudest or most demanding? How often does loyalty become a tool others can exploit? Michael Anthony never tried to be the face of Van Halen. He tried to be its foundation. And when foundations are strong, people stop noticing them until they are gone. In his later years, Anthony did not chase validation. He continued to play, to tour, and to connect with audiences who understood the value of what he brought. He found fulfillment in collaboration rather than control, in shared joy rather than dominance. That choice reframed his legacy. He became a symbol not of what he lost, but of what he preserved: integrity, professionalism, and love for the craft itself. There is no denying that his story contains unresolved pain. Opportunities for closure were missed. Conversations were never had. Words that might have softened wounds were left unspoken. Yet Anthony does not carry those absences as weapons. He carries them as facts. That distinction matters. It allows the story to remain human rather than turning into a cautionary tale fueled by blame. Ultimately, Michael Anthony's legacy is not defined by contracts, credits, or exclusions. It is defined by sound, by the way a song holds together, by the way a harmony lifts a chorus, by the way restraint can be more powerful than excess. His contribution to rock history is embedded in moments that continue to move people long after the arguments have faded. When the noise surrounding Van Halen finally settles into history, what will remain is the music. And within that music, Michael Anthony's work will continue to speak, steady and unbroken. Not as a footnote, but as a reminder that greatness is rarely a solo act, even when the spotlight insists otherwise.